Hello everybody, my name is Mike Geig, and welcome to another live presentation on Twitch TV for the Unity game engine. So before we start, just want to have you all look at the chat window there on Twitch, and you will see a link, which will link you to the chat room that we are using, a chat roll application. The URL is chatroll.com/UnityTech. So I'd like to encourage the viewers, anyone who's on here now or will be here to go ahead and talk in the chat, maybe ask any questions that you have or any comments that you might have, because that's what we're here for. We're going through some stuff and we want to hear from you, and we want to know how we're doing and what we can answer for you, and anything else like that. So feel free to hop in the chat room, say hello. You have myself and Will Goldstone in the chat. Also, I'll pop this up here real quick. You can reach us all on Twitter, and so I have the Twitter handles up there right now, at Unity3D, at Mike Geig, at Will Goldstone, and at the Ant Ranch. So just message us any questions or comments or feedback or anything like that. Great. All right. So hopefully everyone can hear me just fine, and we can go ahead and get started. So in the last video, we talked about the concept of game objects, components, coordinate systems, and transforms. So we're going to go ahead and elaborate more on that this week. We're going to talk about this concept of models and meshes, kind of how they work in Unity, and we're going to talk about the art asset pipeline. So we're going to see how textures, materials, and shaders work together to give our models unique looks, and how we work with them in Unity, so that we can, from here, start doing some pretty in-depth and good-looking detail and stuff like that. So it ultimately boils down to textures, and we're going to look at kind of how they're applied. So to start, I want to start talking about kind of this idea of models or meshes, all right? And a lot of people don't know the difference between models and meshes, or whether or not they're usable interchangeably or anything like that. So basically, the term model and mesh is often used very interchangeably, but a mesh is simply a collection of 3D points that, when combined together, define some physical presence or some physicality of some object. Okay, so if I were to say come up here to game object, create other, and sphere, all right, we will have a sphere mesh with a very basic material texture on it. Okay, and the mesh itself is what defines the sphere as a circular object in 3D space. It's all the vertices and stuff like that. Now, when we take a mesh and we turn it into something that has, a texture, a shader, a material, and any components and whatnot, we then have a model. Okay, so the model is kind of the thing that contains the mesh and all the other stuff. So you're going to hear me use model and mesh kind of interchangeably, but that's the difference, and some programs treat them very different, some programs treat them exactly the same, but that's basically the difference between the two. All right, so every mesh is made up of a series of triangles. All right, we use triangles in 3D programming because it is the most complex, what I want to say, flat shape, polynomial, that's probably not polynomial, polygon, sorry about that, polygon, that is also simple enough to make up shapes and allow us to build very complex things. So we have this sphere here, and if I get closer, you can see how it's really just a series of these triangles. And we use triangles for a few different reasons. First, every series of 3 points will define some shape. Okay, you can always connect 3 dots without the lines ever crossing over each other. All right, so that's one reason we always go with triangles. The second is 3 points will always produce a flat shape. 4 points you can skew and create a shape that's not flat. So triangles really are king when we're dealing with 3D programming. So you will see that everything is made up of triangles and has different you might hear like the number of vertices, number of polygons, and stuff like that. And what we're talking about is the number of triangles that make up any particular object. And as a matter of fact, if I come over here in a game and I turn on my stats, you can see the number of tries and verts and things like that that all go into a scene. So we can see that this sphere here has 525 vertices, all right, to make up this round sphere. If I were to get rid of the sphere and I were to say bring in a cube instead, all right, and I come back into my stats, I can now see that I have 12 triangles with 24 vertices. So we can often see the complexity of what is in our scene by coming into the game mode and turning on our stats and kind of seeing all the stuff that all the triangles and vertices and stuff like that make up the stuff in our scene. All right. So just know, if you're interested in modeling, or you do modeling, or you're a game developer and you're working with modelers and things like that, the number of polygons or the number of triangles that build an object is important. Too many and your scene starts to run slow and it becomes very hard to process and render all that information. So just keep in mind how these things are put together. So that's kind of the concept of the mesh. And if we see here, so I have my cube now, and if I come over here to the right in the inspector view, I can see that I have a cube mesh filter, and I also have a mesh renderer, and I also have this thing that says default diffuse. Okay, so what we're looking at here is we're looking at a couple different things. First, there's the mesh filter and the mesh renderer, and these have to do with how the object is drawn in our scene. And then we have the default diffuse, which is what's called a material. And the material we'll talk about shortly, but the material basically is the skin, if you will, for the mesh that gives us a more robust model experience. Okay. So Unity has built in several meshes, all right, so pre-built primitive objects that we have access to that we can use, and it actually makes things fairly simple. So if I need, say, a box, right, I don't need to go out and make a box or anything like that. Such a thing already exists in Unity, all right, and the way we can access these is if we come here to Game Object and go to Create Other, or if we come to our Hierarchy view and click Create. Either way, we can see this area right here, and we can see that we have a cube, a sphere, a capsule, cylinder, plane, and quad. All right, and these are the built-in primitive meshes that Unity makes available to us to do whatever we want with, right? To put textures on, to have physics, to be simple boxes, simple cylinders, to sculpt with, whatever. And you've seen me use the cube and the sphere a lot, but maybe you haven't seen something like the capsule. So by clicking the capsule, we get something that is effectively a capsule. All right, it is circular, has this kind of dome shape at the top. It's kind of a mixture between a cylinder and a sphere. Okay, and this is useful for all sorts of things. This is great, like the capsule collider, which is what comes on a capsule. As we can see over here in the inspector, we have the capsule collider. Is useful for our, say, things like our first-person controllers, which simulate, you know, for like motion, or that simulate like the player running around like in a first-person shooter style of game. So the capsule collider is very useful. And the capsule object, again, is very useful, especially for creating things like, I don't know, bullets in a shooter, and we want something just very basic. We can use little capsules and things like that. So it's a very useful shape, all right? So let's go ahead and get rid of that. And other shapes that we need to be aware of, obviously we have cylinder. Cylinder, again, very basic shape. It is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. It's a cylinder. But here's one that a lot of people often get confused with. So we have plane, and we have a new shape. This shape is new as of, I believe, Unity 4.2. I think it's Unity 4.2. I'm not 100% certain. It is new as of Unity 4. Anyway, so let's talk about the difference between these, because a lot of people don't know. So first off, we have the plane, and I'll create a plane, and I get this. And a plane, while it is scaled to 1, 1, 1, is really 10 Unity units wide and tall. All right, so a plane is this big, flat surface. It can be scaled and everything, but the key to the plane is it's only drawn on one side. All right, so it's two-dimensional. It's only drawn on one side to save having to draw a side that we can't possibly see. All right, so we have this plane, okay, and it's rather big, and we can see that it's made up of a lot of vertices and a lot of triangles. So if I come over to the game, we can see that it's 121 vertices and 200 triangles, okay? I'm not going to count. That seems a bit high, but maybe. Anyway, I'm not going to bother counting. But we have this plane here, okay? And the plane is great. The problem is if you need something small or something that doesn't have so many triangles in it, right? Because remember, it's always about keeping the number of triangles in a particular scene lower will increase our efficiency and make things run more smoothly. So we have a new object called a quad. And I'm going to kind of scroll over to the side here so it'll come up behind it, or beside it. And I'm going to create this. I'm going to create a quad. And now look at the difference. So the quad is one of these particular squares. All right, there's our quad. So our quad is just a nice, very basic. Oops. By the way, hitting the spacebar makes it go full screen. I don't know if I ever said that before, but I move around like it's a first-person shooter, so I'm always tempted to hit space to kind of go up, and that's not how it works. But the quad is just a very basic plane. Again, the quad is only drawn on one side. So if we turn it around, it disappears. And it's just small and it's basic. It doesn't use as many triangles. So, so just so you know, as you're looking through that, Unity has these built-in primitives, and these built-in primitives are useful for doing, you know, all sorts of little things. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of these now. Again, I'd like to take a second to remind you that you can use the chat, which is chatroll.com/UnityTech. Hop on over there and chat with us for the people that are in the room now. So, okay. So we've looked at these built-in primitive shapes, and there's things we can do with it. Like if I wanted a soup can, I could use a cylinder, stuff like that, and I don't have to model. If you are in the process of, say, prototyping a game, where you don't necessarily have an artist on your team, or you are the artist and you haven't had time to make models yet, or you know your artists are working but they don't have anything done for you yet, but you want to start working on a mechanic, or any particular reason that you would need a visual stand-in without actually having a model, right? So a professionally made whatever, right? You can often build these primitive models using the built-in Unity primitive meshes to achieve effects that you need to sort of prototype your scenes or your games or your mechanics, right? For instance, I could obviously take something like, say, a cube, and I could scale it a little bit, and then another sphere, and put that on top, and build something like a very primitive looking, oops, I keep doing that spacebar, very primitive looking torso or whatever. I'm not saying this is something that you would have as a final asset in a game. I'm saying that this is something that could save you some time to use while you're waiting for art assets to come into a game. So you can build primitive little models here, primitive little doodads, if you will, to, you know, to fill your scene and to use however it is you need. So you can achieve some pretty cool stuff in this manner. All right. So let's say you are at a point where you no longer want to use the built-in primitives. You're at a point where you are ready to work with actual models. You might be wondering, well, how do I get the models into my assets, into my scene, into my project? Depending on if you've experienced other engines or not, you may know that in some engines it's actually pretty difficult to get stuff into the game, right? It has to be in specific formats or have specific names or whatever. Unity, it's not very difficult at all. It's actually really simple to bring anything you want into a project because it's all very folder based. So I could just drag anything I wanted here into the project view. Now I like to have a bit of organization when I work. So I might right click on the assets down here in the project view and come to create and come to folder and have something like, I don't know, maybe models. I should more accurately call it meshes, but I'll call it models, whatever. So I have this models folder now, and if I click on it, I can see obviously that it's empty. And what I have here is I have another folder that I just have kind of off to the side, and I have this torus.fbx. Now, Unity supports all sorts of model formats. I actually have a little list here. It supports FBX, DAE, 3DS, DXF, and OBJ. So those are the formats that I know it supports. It might support more. If it does, I don't particularly know about it, but you know, who knows? Maybe you'll have a format and you'll try and it'll work just great. So what I have here is a torus.fbx, and if you're watching along, don't worry about needing to follow along. This is just a conceptual thing here, but I'll go ahead and just drag this over and drop it in here. I believe I made this in Blender. I believe FBX was Blender. I think that's how I made it. I don't quite remember. It was just something really simple and basic. But so I click and drag it and I drop it in here, and what we get automatically is this torus file with this materials folder. So Unity handles the import process for me completely. All I really had to do is drag and drop, and it works just fine. And now I have my files in the scene. Or I'm sorry, my files in the project. Not quite in the scene just yet. So the torus here is this mesh, and if I click on it in the inspector view, we see all this stuff for it, all these things for it. And the materials folder is the material that goes on the mesh so that we can see it. Now by default, if I go in this folder, we just have this material called no name, and it's white, and it's diffuse, and it's boring, right? That's the default material when there is no other material to find. And we'll talk here in a little bit about materials, and we'll talk about how we can go ahead and add materials and make things look better. Alright, so first thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and just take my torus and I'm going to click and drag it into the scene. If I do that, I'll just drop it right here. You might say, well, where is it? Right? What happened? Well, what you don't realize is it came into the scene, but it came in the scene very, very small. The way it was built in Blender is that it's very tiny. All right. Now I could from here scale it up, right? Make it bigger, and it's a slow enough process, and eventually I'll have it the right size, you know, and in shape that I want. But that's kind of boring, so I'm gonna go ahead and delete that. And instead, what I'm gonna do is I'm going to click on my torus, all right, and I'm gonna come in here to my inspector. Now, my torus mod, so there's three tabs here: model, rig, and animation for these meshes. I don't have any animations on this. It's a simple ring, so in order to save on that, I'm just going to uncheck that and hit apply. So it's not attempting to find any animations inside here. I'm going to skip rig because I don't have any rigging on this, and I'm going to go to model, and I'm going to see that it comes in with a scale factor of 0.01, which means whatever dimensions it had, it's going to be reduced by 1/100th, all right, of its size, which is obviously why it's very small. So I'm going to change that to 1, and I'm going to hit apply, and I'm going to go ahead now and click and drag it, and we can see how big it is. Okay, obviously much bigger now. This is its actual dimensions and physicality, and we can see here that it has you know, all of its triangles building it, and it has this very boring basic material on it that just turns it white. Alright, you'll also notice that now that it's in the scene, it has all of these things on it. So the torus file itself, the torus.fbx, had all these things that had to do with the mesh itself. Alright, its scale, you know, optimization and stuff like that. But when I bring it into the scene, alright, we can see that it has a transform, has a torus mesh filter, mesh renderer, has an animator, which it obviously does not need, and has a, so actually just remove that. Goodbye. And has this no name material, which again is very white and very boring. Okay, so it has all this stuff on it, you know, that's built for you that you don't necessarily need to worry about. So bringing objects in to Unity is actually fairly simple. You just basically have your object on file and you click and drag, and there it is, right? So it's actually a pretty straightforward process, not a whole lot to it. And this works for any model that I might have on my computer at any time. I just click and drag it into my project view, and then click and drag it into my scene, and there you have it. Okay. Now, there are slight differences between the model, the mesh that exists here and the mesh that exists here. For instance, if I were to change this to 0.1 and hit apply, all right, you can see that it's going to change this one here. All right, and this one here is going to have some strange scaling on it and whatnot. So it's always good. It's always a good practice. Let me delete that again. Always a good practice to get your settings on the file correctly before trying to bring it in the scene. It's always better to have the base asset to be of the settings that you want before attempting to bring it into the scene and try to make it work however it is, you know, by fiddling with it and stuff like that. Alright, so that's how you take a model that you personally have with you and bring it into Unity. Now, what if you don't have a model that you want? Alright, you might have heard of something called the Unity Asset Store. Okay, that's something that Unity has implemented, and it allows you to either get free assets that are made available for people to use by generous by generous folks, or it's a site or a place where you can buy assets, right? If there's anything particular that you want, people can sell assets. Or maybe you're a content creator yourself. A lot of people have, you know, their entire business around selling assets on the asset store. So if you're a content creator, maybe you want to make some stuff and sell it on the asset store, and you can certainly do that. So what I'm going to show you now is how we can take, or how we can get a model from the asset store and bring it into our scene. All right. So to access the asset store, we're going to come up here to this menu option called Window, and we're going to come to Asset Store. You can also see that I could hit Control 9, or I believe on Mac that's Command 9. So either Control 9 or Command 9, and we'll click that, and we will get into the asset store. While that's loading up, I'll say hello to Shellout and that playing dude who said hello in chat. Howdy, how you doing? We're just waiting for the asset store to open up, and then we will be underway. If this is the first time you have used the asset store, you may be prompted for a login. Or I might be prompted for a login. I'm not really sure right now. The login, you know, it's a free login. You just have to sign up for it, and you get in. So if you're prompted for that, you know, go ahead and sign up for that real quick, and then just follow along. It's a real simple thing. I think it's just your name and your email address or whatever. But once you log in, you'll see a screen that's very similar to this, and we have promoted assets, and we've got options here on the side, and we have search, and we have top paid and deals and all sorts of stuff. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up here into the search bar, and I'm going to type because I'm looking for my favorite free asset, Space Robot Kyle. Space Robot Kyle is my favorite free asset. It's great for using for testing all sorts of stuff. If I'm testing animations, or I'm testing some scenery or whatever. But you will notice while I'm here all these other robot related things on the asset store. Some of them are free, some of them are paid, whatever, but you can find the stuff that you're looking for and bring it into your game. So I'm going to click on Space Robot Kyle, and that's going to bring me to Space Robot Kyle's specific page, and I can see that he is free. And I have a couple options here. So I have this button that says Import. You will probably have a button that says Download or Download and Import, because I've already downloaded it before. All right, I've used this before, so it already exists on my system. So I have a re-download and import if I want, or I can just import it. So if this is the first time you're ever using this asset, you will have to download it first, and then there will be a button that just says Download and Import, and then you just have to wait. I don't think it's that big, but it's 10 megabytes. But so I'm just going to go ahead and click Import, since I already have the files on my system. And I will get this little window that is acting weird. Render. Okay, so, alright, well this little window does not want to render appropriately on that screen while I'm recording my screen. So that's very peculiar. So wait a minute, let me click this again. Do I get... Huh, okay. So an interesting side effect of the recording software that I'm using is if I try to click and drag this window to where you guys can see it, it goes wonky. So I'm going to go ahead and just hit import again. It's going to open the screen off my screen, but I'll just tell you what I'm seeing. So basically what it does, it's an importing package dialog, and it lists all of the different assets that are part of this particular model. All right, so the different textures and stuff like that. And then I have the option to choose all of them, none of them, cancel, or import. So what I basically do is I choose all of them, right, because I want all of the assets associated with this model, and I just click import. So sorry that you can't see that. Obviously, there's something I need to test out or test around with this program, but yeah. Anyway, it's importing now, so hopefully we won't have that issue anymore. So if you're following along and you see that, just click the import button. All right, and now I can see it exists down here in my scene. So I'm going to go ahead and close the asset store. All right, and now I have a new folder called Robot Kyle. And I may want to click and drag that into my models folder. I'm not going to worry about it too much. I'm just going to leave it out here separate. And if I expand it, I see that I have materials, which I have a material already made for this, the model itself, and specific textures for it. So I'm going to leave the materials and textures alone because we're going to talk about those here very shortly. And now I'm just going to click and drag Robot Kyle into my scene, and I can see Robot Kyle in all of his glory. Alright, and he's a little bit lower than I want, so we'll bring him up here. I also want him to be rotated. So we can see Robot Kyle. Here, I'll put him in a fun little isometric view, and I'll actually come up, so you can actually come down, look up at him. So he's all heroic. And there we go. We have a heroic Robot Kyle. Okay. So we can see that he is, I guess, is a mesh that has a texture applied to it, making it, making the whole thing together, this model, which has, it actually has rigging and has all sorts of stuff. As a matter of fact, if I click on the asset robot Kyle.fpx and I hit this little arrow, I can actually expand it out and see what's inside of it. And you can see that we have these little these root nodes and stuff like that inside of it that make it up. And I can expand it up here and see all the different pieces that make up this model. I'm not going to mess with any of that right now. I just kind of wanted to show you how that you can use assets from the asset store to bring stuff into your scene, right? So you're not really limited only to the stuff that you can make, right, or the files that you can find on the internet. There are a ton of assets on the asset store. There are a bunch of things that you can find and use in your product or projects to make it look great, to do all sorts of cool stuff. All right. So as you're working, feel free to keep an eye on the asset store and always look for things that you might need, be it sound effects, animations, whatever. Right? There's always cool stuff on there. Okay. Again, I want to remind you all that feel free to use the chat, which is chatroll.com/UnityTech. I'll post the link again. So as you're following along, feel free to engage with us in the chat room and ask any questions you might have or anything like that. Okay, so we have this robot that we've dragged into the scene that they've pulled from the asset store. We can obviously bring as many of them as we want. And if we modify the original, we can then modify all the other ones. Like if I were to change the rigging or change the size on this, the other ones would change appropriately, and that's a lot of very tall robots. And we can modify this in any meaningful way that we would like. Okay, so I think I've exhausted what I want to talk about with meshes and models now. So let us talk more about this art asset pipeline. Okay, so I've talked about the actual physical elements of a model, right, with the mesh, right? But now let's talk more about the art elements of the mesh, or of the model, okay? So Unity has what we call the art asset pipeline. I've got a little infographic here for you that I'll pop up. And basically what we have is we have a model, and to the model we apply a model's material. Now the model's material, which is an asset itself, which is a file, has two parts to it. It has a texture and has a shader. All right, and the texture and the shader are applied to the model, or applied to the material, and the material is applied to the model. Okay, and that's kind of the flow about how we go and do things. All right, so whenever you bring a model in, like say our torus model, which I'll bring back up here, the torus, and it has this white material to it. Now I didn't create that white material, I didn't build that in Blender. Unity applied that automatically because every model or every mesh in order to be visible has to have a material on it. Alright, so it's this boring white material. But we could really make any material we want, okay? And we do that using these textures. So let me go ahead and clean up my scene a little bit here. I'm going to go ahead and remove these extra robots. And in the name of staying organized, I'm going to go ahead and create a new folder. I'm going to create two new folders actually. I'm going to create a materials folder, and I'm going to go ahead and create a textures folder. Okay. So what I want to do is I want to import I want to import a new texture into my game. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the textures folder, and again I'm going to bring this little Explorer window over here. And I have this brick texture.png, and I'm just going to go ahead and click and drag and drop it in here, and now it gets added to my scene. Alright, again, importing things into Unity are as simple as dragging and dropping. It's really that simple. Now a texture itself is just a flat file. Okay, it's just a PNG, a JPG, or a JPG, or anything like that. a texture itself cannot be applied directly to a mesh. Okay, what that means is I can't take just a texture and put it on a mesh. Only materials go on meshes, right? Luckily, I can take my texture and attempt to put it on a mesh. Oh, let me expand this here. Let me find the mesh. Attempt to put it on the mesh, and what will effectively happen is it will create a new material for me. All right, so I can sort of cheat. So I'm going to go ahead and just drag it over here to where it says Robot 2, or actually with Robot 2 selected by, well, here, let me explain what I just did. So with Robot Kyle up here in the hierarchy, Robot Kyle is just an empty game object that contains all the pieces of him. So I'm going to go ahead and expand it by clicking the little down arrow, and that leads me to Robot 2, which is the actual mesh. So I'm going to take the brick texture and drag it over to that and let go, and we'll see that he is now a brick wall robot thingy. And since he is a brick wall robot thingy, we can see that a new material was actually, or it was actually applied to the material that was on this, right? Which now we have this brick texture material, which is just this basic brick texture, all right, and has a shader and has this other stuff to it. So we can just click and drag, but I'd much rather see us approach this from a much more formal way, a much better workflow. But you can kind of work in any way that really makes the most sense to you. So I'm going to go ahead and actually just get rid of that guy right there, and I'm going to go ahead and bring a cube into my scene. I just want to work with a cube right now. So we have this cube. Great. So we have this brick texture.png that we click and dragged in there, and when I click on it I can see that what it looks like down here in the preview window, and I can see some different settings for it, and we'll revisit these settings here in a little bit. And I could just again click and drag this onto the brick and it would create a material for me, but I'm going to go through the formal process of creating material so that we can kind of control more about how it works. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here to my materials folder, and you can see that we actually have a material that was created in the materials folder when I just clicked and dragged that onto the robot, and I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that. Alright, because that was auto-generated for me and I want to make it myself. So I'm going to right click anywhere in this blank space, and I'm going to go to create material. Alright, and I see new material. I'm going to call that diffuse brick. Diffuse brick. Just because I know that I want it to be a diffuse material, which I'll explain here in a second, and it's going to contain my brick. So I've created this, and when I click on it, we have up here in the inspector. So every material is made up of the two parts that I showed you earlier, a shader and the texture itself. Alright, so my shader is right here, and it's a drop-down list, and I have a bunch of shaders available to me. Now some of the more advanced shaders are pro only, but a lot of them are available for the free version of Unity. So chances are what you need will probably be in the free version, unless you're doing some like advanced rendering stuff or something that has to do a lot with lighting and whatnot, then it'll probably be in pro. So I have a lot of choices. The default is diffuse, and diffuse is very flat, alright, which means it's evenly lit. Alright, so you'll have an even amount of lighting from vertex to vertex. I can't remember what type of shading model or lighting shading model it is. I think it might be Lambert, but I don't remember off the top of my head. But diffuse is the very basic. Alright, in diffuse, so the shader, here I'll just say this, the shader is responsible for telling the material which properties it takes. Alright, so with diffuse, we have just a main color, a texture, and some tiling and offset. If I were to change this to say bumped diffuse, you would see that I now have the texture, a main color, our offsets, and a normal map. If I were to do specular, I would have shininess and the specular color. If I were to do decal, I'd have a section for a decal, so on and so forth. So the shader kind of determines what properties the material can take. So I'm going to come back to diffuse. I'm just going to leave it as diffuse for now. And for my texture, I can either click and drag my brick wall and drop it in here, or just hit select. And I can see all the textures that exist in my scene, and I'm going to click the brick texture. And now that my material, diffuse brick, has the brick texture applied to it, if I put it on my cube, I can see what it looks like. Alright, and I have this nice flat, evenly lit, just cube made of bricks. All right. I can change the color, as we can see, which will affect how the texture looks. I'm gonna go back to white just so it's the base brick texture. I also want to look at the tiling and the offset. So the offset allows me to change, it's between 0 and 1, so 1 would be silly. It allows me to change how it is affected. We can kind of see how it moves a little bit. So 0.6, right, kind of moves it around. So I'll leave the offset back to 0, but you can see that we can actually manipulate the UV coordinates of the model to kind of shift the texture left or right or up and down. I also have the ability to control tiling, which is how many times it repeats. So if I have it 3 and 3, that texture will be repeated 3 times, right, on one face. Okay, with 1, it's only 1 time per face. All right, so on and so forth. Something we're noticing here, and I want to point it out now because it's important to pay attention to, is I'm going to go back to where it was 3 and 3 because it was pretty obvious. You might notice that we have some blurring on this particular triangle face of the front of the cube, and here, where the texture is not drawn very sharp. Okay, we can fix that in the texture settings. All right, I just wanted to point this out now in case you're seeing that and you're like, man, why is it so blurry? I'm going to show you how to fix that. If we come into textures and we click brick texture, we have something called an aniso level. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. I always call it aniso level. I've never actually heard anyone else say it out loud. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring that up to 3. And I'm going to hit apply. Moving file failed. Well, that's no good. Okay, worked that time. I don't know what that was, but I hit OK or try again and it worked. So, yeah, all right. And we can see that this is smoothed out a bit. We still have a little bit of blurring, all right, but it's better. The aniso level is basically what the quality of texture is when we're looking at it at an extreme angle. We use that for things like floors and ceilings and stuff like that. Actually, let me improve that even a little bit better. At some point, we're going to get diminishing returns. It's not going to make it all that much sharper. So that's good enough for me now. So we have this diffuse tiled material with our brick texture. Now let's change the shader. Let's say we want this brick wall to look wet or to be shiny. I can come to diffuse and I can change this to specular, right? And now I have this new option called shininess, which I can actually increase or decrease, increase, all right? And so we can make it look like a flashlight is hitting it or whatever, to the point where it's real shiny, okay? Which we have a lot of control over there. We can change what color the specular highlight is, right? White to make it super shiny, or maybe it's a red light glowing on it, so it's more red. We can leave it at the basic brown there. So we have that option as well to use the type of shader to affect how this looks. One more I want to talk about is bumped diffuse. All right, so I'm going to select that there, bump diffuse. Now bump diffuse gives us one more option, which is this normal map. Now I have a normal map available for this particular texture, and I'm going to show you the effect that that's going to have. Normal maps are great. So bumped materials, are bumped shaders on materials with a normal map allow us to provide a lot of graininess maybe, or texture, I guess, or detail to something that's flat. All right. So this particular brick wall is a flat cube. All right. We don't have little divots and stuff like that anywhere on there. It's flat. But using a normal map, we can tell the renderer which way the faces of our cube are looking, which parts are bumpy, which parts aren't. And so when the scene is lit and the rendering occurs, it can look more 3D than it actually is. And I'll show you how to do that. So I'm going to come back down here to my textures folder where I have my brick texture. And again, I'm going to bring this window over here. And I have this brick normal, which is a normal map. And I'm going to click and drag it over here and drop it in. Alright, and now I have this normal map here. Now the normal map is just a simple PNG, and it happens to look kind of weird and purple and stuff like that. It only looks like that because Unity thinks this is an actual texture. So if I were to apply this to the brick, it would turn the brick, you know, purple. So if I were to click over here and change my texture to the normal map, right, that's what it would look like, and that's obviously not what we want. So I'll change that back here. So instead, what we want to tell Unity is this isn't a texture, this is a normal map. And I do that by selecting the texture from the project view, coming up here to the inspector, and where it says texture type, I click the drop down from texture to normal map, and then I hit apply. Alright, now Unity knows this isn't a normal texture, we're not going to draw this, this is a normal map. If I come over here to my diffuse brick material now, and I click select, I'll see my normal map, and we'll click that. Now, I know what you're thinking, that's not good, that doesn't look right. And it only doesn't look right because I'm tiling my texture 3 times and my normal map only once. So let's tile my normal map more times. There we go. And so now they line up, and you can see how we have just a stronger level of detail on the brick. Okay, so again, if I'm just diffuse versus bumped diffuse, okay, so the normal map makes it textury, gives it a lot of 3D detail. The idea is that it would take a lot of polygons to achieve this sort of textured, bumpy look on a brick wall, right? If you had to manually sculpt each one of these little bumps, right, it would take you a very, very long time to create, and it would also be really, really, really obscenely high poly, and it would really slow down your whole scene. So we can use normal mapping, so with these bump maps, if you will, or normal maps to create bumped shaders. We can use these to achieve a high level of effect, all right, without increasing the rendering time, without increasing any of the overhead of the system. So it's one more little tool in our bag to kind of give ourselves a lot more depth and quality without sacrificing speed and performance. So with that said, what I want to do, kind of the last thing I want to do here, is I'm going to create 4 orbs with 4 different textures, because I feel that it really helps to drive home the idea of the material textures and shaders when you get to see all the different types side by side, all right? Because clicking between one or the other is great, but it's not really until you can see them all that it is really effective. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this here, this cube. Goodbye, cube. And I want to explain kind of what I have here in my scene right now. So this was made before I started the video just because I just had this happen to be here. But I have a directional light already in my scene. All right, it's right up there. And a directional light is just a ton of parallel light lines for even lighting, kind of like if you had a sun, all right? So the sun in the sky kind of gives us nice parallel light. So a directional light simulates, you know, a sun in the sky. I also have my camera, and something kind of special I did with the camera is I moved it back from its normal position. It's at -13. And I changed its field of view down to 31. And the reason I did that is because if the camera is close to an object with a wide field of view to fit the whole object in, you get sort of this distortion, this fish lens, this wide angle lens effect, right? But if you move it away and narrow your field of view, the stuff looks a little bit more accurate. Alright, so I did this because I'll be working with spheres, so you'll see what I'm talking about. I'll even move it back and show you what the effect was otherwise. So what I want to do is I want to create 4 spheres. So I'm going to go ahead and create a sphere, and I'm going to scale it to 2, 2, and 2, just so it's a little bit bigger. And I'm going to put it at -2, 2.2, -5. Alright, and we'll look in my camera here, and we see it's in the upper left-hand corner there, so great. So I have this sphere, and I'm going to go ahead and duplicate it by right-clicking, say duplicate. And I'll put the other one at 2, and then I'll right click and duplicate, and I'll put this one at 0, and I'll right click and duplicate and put this one at -2. So I have one at negative, where am I at here? Get the right tool. Why can't I select that? It's weird. It's behaving weird. I should be able to click it and select it. There we go. Apparently I can't with the hand tool because that's just for panning. So this one's at -2, 2.2, -5. This one's at 2, 2.2, negative 5, then 2, 0, negative 5, and negative 2, 0, negative 5. Okay, so the effect is that we have a sphere in kind of laid out like this. And to kind of show you the way the camera was, all right, if I move it forward, we'll say put it at negative 10 where it starts, with a more of a field of view, I believe it starts at 60, we can see how things look distorted, how they look like eggs, more ovals. That's why I moved it back. So we get rid of that fish eye lens kind of look to it, drop that back down to, let's say, like 31, and it distorts a lot less. So just kind of explaining what I've done, so you, if you're following along or you're curious because you try this later, that's why I moved it back, just to kind of avoid that distortion. Okay, so we have our 4 spheres, and I'm going to click on my diffuse brick material, and I'm going to change that back to just being diffuse, all right, with our 3-3 tiling, and I'm going to put that in the upper left-hand corner. All right, so we have our first material, all right. Then I'm going to go ahead and create a new material, and I'm going to call this one bump diffuse brick. Bump diffuse brick, all right. And I will have this one, I will change its shader to be bumped diffuse, and I will choose its materials, the brick texture, or I'm sorry, its texture as the brick texture, and a normal map, and I will change the tiling to be 3 on both. There we go. And I will take that and I'll put it on the upper right hand corner one. So now we can already see the difference between the two. It's a pretty significant difference. The reason I'm putting this on spheres is because the difference becomes much more obvious. With a curved face and the light's hitting it from the upper left, you can see how the light doesn't go dark in the ridges here, but it does go dark in the ridges here. So it's doing real-time light calculation on this object, this normal mapped object, even though it's technically flat. I mean, it is a sphere, it's just flat, but the normal map really gives us a lot of texture. Alright, so then I'm going to create a new material, which I will call specular brick. Ooh, spelled brick wrong. There's a C in there. Specular brick, which I will change to be specular. There we are. And I'll change its texture to be our brick texture, again tiling 3 and 3, and I will put that down here so we can see the effect of the shininess. And I'll create one more, and this one's going to be, I'm just going to summarize, I'm going to go spec bumped brick, spec bumped brick, which I'm going to make bumped specular. And I'll choose my brick texture and my brick normal map. I'll set this to 3 and 3, just like this, and I finally will apply this last one. So we can see what we have. So you can see the great difference that a material and a shader can have on a mesh, right? Even on a texture. So what we have, oh, okay, so sorry to interrupt. We have a question here, Joshua Dunn. How are the normal maps made? So normal maps are generally made in whatever software that you use to make the texture. I know that you can make the normal maps in, say, Photoshop. It's kind of a more difficult topic than just explaining right here in this presentation. But basically, as you can see, the colors that are used right here. So when we first brought it in, the colors that this picture has, these colors correspond to facing values, and we use those colors to dictate which way is forward, which way is backwards, which way is up and down and left and right. So it might be better to maybe link some resources on how to make the normal maps, because it's not really something I can explain in here. For one, I'm not much of a graphics guy, so it would take me a long time to remember how to do it and show everybody. And two, it would be harder to just open this up in the middle of this tutorial. But so basically, they're made with any graphical application because it is just a .png. All right, it's just an image, but there are special filters you can use to assist you and stuff like that. Oh, hey, there you go. Will Goldstone explains that they can be made in third-party apps like XNormal, or Unity can generate them from a texture. So there you go. Yeah. But anyway, thanks for the question. Hopefully that didn't confuse you too much. I don't I don't make a lot of normal maps, so I don't have a great answer for you. But kind of going back to our example here, just to show you, we use one mesh, which is a sphere, and we use one texture, which is a brick. And using the different shaders and a normal map, right, you can see that we achieve 4 very different effects. As a matter of fact, I could take any one of these and, like, say this one here, and change the color of it slightly, you know, and again achieve a very different effect. So the idea is that you don't necessarily need to make a bunch of different textures and a bunch of different meshes to achieve a bunch of different looks, right? You can maybe say have an enemy, and when the enemy takes damage they turn red. But you don't need a red texture. You can just change the color of the material to red, right? And so the enemy flashes red when they take damage, or something along those lines. We can achieve a lot of effect using these different tools. Okay, so that's going to pretty much sum up what I wanted to talk about today. So we basically talked about models versus meshes. We talked about what meshes are and how they're made up of these triangle components. All right, and we talked about why we use triangles. We talked about creating your own meshes and importing them. All right. We talked about how Unity supports FBX, DAE, 3DS, DXF, and OBJ formats. We talked about how we can find assets on the asset store and bring the models into the asset store. We talked about how the art asset pipeline in Unity works. And we talked about materials, shaders, and textures. All right, and we looked at how we can apply them to our meshes to achieve some pretty neat effects and to change the way things look. So I'm going to sort of wrap up there now. Do we have any questions from anybody watching along? And while I wait for some questions, I am going to pull this back up again. It's how you can reach us on Twitter. Please, I openly encourage anyone to ask any questions on Twitter, give us some feedback, tell us how we're doing, tell us maybe something you want to see. Absolutely would love some feedback. Another thing, kind of something new that I'd love to ask, is if you wouldn't mind contacting us, or either through our Facebook page or through Twitter, kind of telling us what time zone you're in and what times would be best to see videos and stuff like that. It would really help us with scheduling and stuff like that. We really do want to do more of these, and we want to make sure that we're reaching as many people as possible. So, you know, just reach out to us, let us know, kind of give us an idea of who our viewership is and when they want to watch. Again, you can reach us on Twitter at Unity3D, at Mike Geig, at Will Goldstone, and at The Ant Ranch. Just reach out to us, and you know, we'll be more than happy to sustain a conversation about it, and you know, bring as good of materials to you as we can. So, thanks everyone for watching. I don't see any questions, so we're gonna go ahead and wrap up, and we'll see you guys next time. Thanks.